Good afternoon, and thank you everybody for joining ThreatX's live Q&A today, talking with experts Mike Privette and our own Jeremy Ventura about the predictions for threats in 2023. We've purposely designed this webinar to be as interactive as possible, so we'll be stopping along the way, answering questions that come up in our chat, or even for folks who'd like to have the mic passed to them, happy to escalate your privileges. But with that, let's go ahead and hop in and meet our experts. So today, helping me lead our session is Mike Privette, CISO at Passport. And Mike's had over 15 years of cybersecurity experience as a CISO, practitioner, creator, entrepreneur, and even a venture capitalist advisor. Mike also runs Return on Security site to share some of his thoughts on cybersecurity and some of the trends. So Mike, would you like to hop in and say hi?
Hey, thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us. Next, we have Jeremy Ventura, who's the field CISO here at ThreatX. Jeremy's an industry leader and cybersecurity professional with lots of experience in a multitude of different areas regarding vulnerability management, email security, incident response, and many others. But most regularly, you can see Jeremy talking on media, posting blogs, and even participating in webcasts. So Jeremy, thank you for the time today.
Yeah, thanks, Sydney. I look forward to it. And thanks, Mike, and welcome to the live Q&A with us.
Lastly, my name is Sydney Cafaro. I'm a certified product manager here at ThreatX. I'm focusing on API security, incident response, and security automation. So with that, let's go ahead and hop on in. Now, to really get this conversation started, what I'd like to begin opening up with is acknowledging the given economic climate. Mike, what do you believe is necessary for security teams to look at as they're preparing for going into the new year?
Yeah, it's going to be a tough climate, more of a continuation of what 2022 has seen. If you look at any of the kind of broader macroeconomic trends, like inflation continues to rise, jobless claims has continued to go up and down. And security firms are also feeling the kind of pressure as well. So there's going to be a lot for security teams who are fighting the good fight every day to defend against, but they're also going to have to be smarter about their investments and smarter about how they allocate their time, which, to be fair, is already really hard to do in this space. But so I think they're going to have to look at like what's really necessary to run their program versus what's a nice to have versus what's like what can they not deliver without, and where can they spend a little extra time, resources, and people time focusing on the areas that give them the most risk management returns on this stuff, because it is after all, you're trying to support a business who's trying to sell product or a service to customers, and so you have to make sure you can do that with as operationally efficient as possible, which I think will be a big change from the past few years of what security teams have probably enjoyed in terms of budget.
Yeah, the thing I'll add on to that is the theme of, I think every organization is going to have to do more with less, right? And I think that's a perfect way to sum up, Mike, a little bit of kind of what you said into a marketing tagline, right? But in actuality, it's true, right? I think as we see budget cuts, as an industry, we struggle to even hire, right, analysts and engineers and certain positions within our own teams, never mind maintain that talent. So with that already precedent, with that already going on within our industry and the challenge of that, now adding this economic recession, organizations have to do more with less. And that really means a couple different things. That means allocating our budget wisely because there are budget cuts. That also means shifting investments into the fundamentals. I don't think we're in a point anymore where organizations are going to go, or CISOs or CIOs are going to go and say, oh, this is a great new tool and it's shiny and it's bright and it's, the next big thing. That may not be the case going into 2023. I think, organizations making sure that what we have today works, or if what we have today doesn't work, how do we find a solution? How do we find a company? How do we find a platform that can really expand into multiple different areas and provide great ROI, right, or return on investment? So that's kind of what I'm seeing kind of coming into 2023, where organizations are really going to have to, double down on the investments they've already made and spend and choose wisely.
Awesome. And again, folks, if people have questions from the audience, please feel free to post them in the live Q&A or in the chat. But just to continue on the same vein, Mike, how do you start to differentiate what is a necessity versus what is a nice to have? Could you give us some context into how you're making some of those decisions?
Yep, sorry, I was on mute. Yeah. So honestly, it comes down to like how well our teams actually implementing and using the technology they bought with the given resources they have, and knowing that they may not get additional resources throughout the rest of the year. To piggyback on Jeremy's point too, like if it's a nice to have, or if it's a shiny tool that does maybe one or two cool functions, that's probably a lot less attractive than like a full suite of something from somebody who can cover a full gamut of security controls or your perimeter or things like that. So I think it's kind of being honest with yourself and being honest with your budgets and saying, all right, what either could we forego, or what could we potentially even spend a little bit more on today to give us a save further out into the next coming years. So I think people will be looking at more kind of strategic partnerships, longer partnerships with vendors they have. We may see the return of the longer deal terms in terms of like, instead of a 1-year agreement, so maybe 2-3 years, so they can get that extra budget benefits. And so they can, help justify to all their internal stakeholders why this particular set of tools is the one that they need to secure the company. So I think it's going to come down to like really making a strong internal business case for yourself too, not just because it sounds cool, I guess.
Yeah, and that makes a whole lot of sense, especially with going into, like we just mentioned, some of the challenges that we've seen in 2022, but will most likely carry over and even expand into 2023. Now, Mike, I realize that you do a ton of research, identifying trends, and even creating content for your website, Return on Security. So I have to ask, what are some of the major trends that you've pulled out for 2023 as it relates to the threats and the threat landscape?
Oh, so I think we're going to see many different new kind of attack trends, but also much more of the same. I think phishing will probably never go away. Ransomwares will still be going, very strong, but it's seen a bit of a downtake at the end of this year as compared to how, fast and furious it was earlier in the year. But I think there has been a lot of high value from attackers kind of systematically dismantling parts of organizations, either to do supply chain attacks, like attack one customer to attack 2 others, or to be a little more targeted. I think there's going to be a kind of explosion of security around no-code tools. Like those no-code and low-code tools just kind of across the world of software have exploded in the past few years. And I think no one really knows what they're agreeing to when they accept those, and they make it so easy to sign up for, which is great for a lot of people. And I use a ton of them myself, but I think no one knows really what level of access you're giving away for some of these things. So I think the SaaS security posture management piece is going to become much more important, just because the proliferation of that is going to be so much more so. I think what's really interesting too, and probably just in the past few weeks, is like a trend I suspect is a lot more deceptive kind of attacks using things like generative AI, ChatGPT, or other types of things to like either have similar live kind of conversations with would-be victims or companies. But the applications are pretty endless and also kind of terrifying. If you look at what people have been doing with ChatGPT just so far. So I think we're just scratching the surface of how that's going to be weaponized against us. So those are some of the things I'm seeing currently.
Interesting. So like chat AI to simulate fraud.
Yeah, simulate fraud, or simulate, hey, I'm your IT admin, I need you to send me the code from your two-factor authentication, or I need to pose as like, a more believable kind of business email compromise fraud with the financial controller, or with the CFO to release funds. Like I think there's and then that doesn't even open up the world to what red teams are going to be doing to these poor blue teams. So I think there's going to be a hard reckoning of like what can be done with that. But it should make pen tests and a lot of other those types of things a lot more interesting for both sides of the equation.
Wow, that's some really interesting findings. Really cool to dig into kind of how these techniques are changing in ways that we probably have never thought of before. Jeremy, as a fast follow, what are your predictions for some of the threats coming up next year?
Yeah, Mike brought up a good point here that maybe in the last couple months, we haven't heard so much in the news of like the next big thing. But historical trends show typically in the first half of a new year is when attackers are at their hot and heaviest. So Mike mentioned supply chain attacks. I mean, I think 2022 was the year of Log4j, right? And organizations scrambling to figure out, where in my environment am I vulnerable, or is Log4j vulnerable? And then how do I go and patch that? How do I work with my partners and the other ecosystem of vendors that I work with to make sure that they're secure, so we're secure and we can provide resiliency to our customers. So I do think supply chain attacks are going to be very prevalent, are going to be very forward focused as far as attackers wanting to attack. The other side of that is also, we can't forget about the geopolitical unrest that's going on in the world. I think in the last 6 months to 9 months here, we've seen a huge increase. And yes, I work for ThreatX, but this is not a ThreatX pitch, but we've seen a huge increase in bot activity. I mean, from Killnet, which is one of the Russian affiliated nation state hacking groups, going after not just Ukraine, but going after the United States, going after Israel, going after Croatia, going after other countries that are part of NATO. So I think, as we go into 23, as we're still unfortunately in a geopolitical crisis, I do think from a nation state, from organizations that are affiliated with nation states, we're going to see an increase in consistent attack pattern from those entities going after different organizations. I mean, a great example, 2022 in the beginning, I know sometimes people forget about it now, but look what happened to Costa Rica and the government, right? When I believe it was the Conti ransomware originally attacked the Costa Rica government, shutting down all different government municipality websites, declaring pretty much war, a cyber war on Costa Rica. And then things went silent. The president came out, said, we're not negotiating with terrorists. Like, this is it. We're going back. What did Conti do? Kind of this whole ransomware as a service, or what I call ransomware 3.0. They said, okay, fine. We'll go and sell kind of the backdoor and the exploits that we got into. So who came in next? The Hive ransomware group, right? And then attacked the Costa Rican Social Security website and entity. And so I think as we go, right, there's all different things here, from supply chain, from geopolitical, but also, as Mike mentioned too, ransomware, right? And I think this ransomware 3.0, where, okay, if you're not going to pay us this ransomware, we'll go ahead and sell this on the darknet, and we'll give kind of the exploits and the vulnerabilities to the next ransomware group so they can attack. So I think we're in, unfortunately, I hate to say it, but troubling times, in a sense that, from even small to medium business organizations here in the United States to operate, I think we need to really go back to the fundamentals, right? We need to understand that it's a combination of people, process, and technology, but at the end of the day, it's people at the end of the day, right? So Mike mentioned phishing. So making sure that we're doing security awareness training for our organizations, right? Making sure we're actually keeping up to date to that, making sure we're keeping our policies and procedures, but additionally, making sure we're doing the fundamentals. It's so much easier said than done. Every time we see these breaches, it always comes back, oh, that vulnerability showed or exploited a patch that was vulnerable from 3 years ago that we didn't update, right? Or this zombie server, zombie API. So, whatever the use case might be, whatever it's going to be the next big one, I think we need to really double down and take a good look at our infrastructure, our people, making sure that we're prepared for the next thing that could potentially happen, going through those simulations as well.
I mean, the whole geopolitical climate and kind of the threats that we're seeing from these different nation state groups, it's a scary but a very reality-inducing scenario that we have to really face. I guess, Mike, I'm going to call on you next, because I know that you're live in the action of it all. What has Passport seen on that kind of side of, threats coming from other nation states?
Yeah, honestly, it's been not a big uptick in what it was before. Passport operates in the US and Canada, so it's, two big markets to attack anyway. Now, there has been a lot more phishing, a lot more, business email compromise attempts. But, in terms of increased frequency, like we're the parking industry is kind of an equal opportunity attack zone, I guess you could say. So they're not specifically targeted the way financial services are, to the same level. But there hasn't been anything additional, but it's part of, even the geopolitical landscape. Part of the security awareness training I actually help give, and kind of reminders to our whole company and to the executive team, is like, you really need to be careful with what you see and say and share online, because misinformation is only going to continue to grow, and then full on disinformation campaigns. Because if anything that we've seen this year is like, there is no longer a hard line between like what is real and fake on the internet, and then all the way up to physical attacks. So like that line is a lot more fluid with the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and I think that will only continue to grow, and especially as nations then start trying to defend themselves in similar manners, or provide like offensive operations that will maybe cut some of those other operations off. Like there's real harm that can be done in that space. So I always share, like, just, be careful what you're actually looking at and sharing on this, because you don't want to, unknowingly get wrapped up in one of these campaigns either.
Yeah, no, absolutely. The whole misinformation side of it, I think some of us have started to have introductions to this. I mean, especially back during the COVID-19 pandemic, I think people saw a rise in articles getting taken down from social media websites just because of disinformation. But with this context of security in mind, I think it opens up whole new doors of not fraudulent activity, but again, data and information that isn't accurate.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. Jeremy, I want to go back to one of your points that you made earlier with doing more with less. And Mike, would love your take on this as well. How would you recommend teams do accomplish that? Do more for less? Is there a change of strategies? Is there a preference of in-house versus partnering with a managed service provider? What does that kind of look like in your eyes?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of a little bit of everything, right? But to break it down and kind of give a clear path for recommendations, it really depends on the organization and the industry that you're in and what you're providing your customers, right? Whether you're Mike and providing, from a passport standpoint, right, mobile applications or platforms that can help cities and municipalities and state governments, or you're providing a tool that, makes a crane, for example, that can pick up logistic heavy material. It all really just depends. But regardless of what industry you're in, I think, doing more with less means making sure that the investments that you've currently made are fitting the budget, but fitting the need of the organization. Now, we kind of touched upon it a little bit before, but in 23, as kind of this economic recession, and we're seeing left and right, and cybersecurity is not prone to this, right? Or not, I should say, not immune to it, where we're seeing layoffs in cybersecurity organizations. We're seeing layoffs in some of the largest tech companies in the world that we never would have imagined this happened. And so I think with that being said, it kind of goes back to making sure that your chips that you're putting on the table are with the right vendors, are with the right solutions that are going to protect your organization. I mentioned earlier, like fundamentals, but I also come from an MSSP space in the past where, it's going to be probably a little bit more prevalent now than ever, where it's hard to hire. It's hard to maintain these employees with all the threats, with the ever-changing landscape, with just attacks coming in left and right. Hiring and partnering and having great relationships with your security vendors or other third-party MSSP services or professional services out there is going to be more important than ever, right? Making sure, one, that they're secure, that's also very important. But number two, making sure that they're providing value to you as well, right? They are an extension of your team, not just, this disconnected company that I partner with. So MSSPs, I think, are going to really, really, really grow as well, just naturally because of budget cuts and budget constraints. Mike, I'm not sure. I know you also kind of lived in the MSSP space and worked with a lot of MSSPs before. If you want to add on to anything particularly with that.
Yeah, no, I would definitely very much echo your comments as well. I think there will be more managed service offerings people are going to take advantage of. I think companies are going to start developing managed service offering if they're not already, because people don't necessarily want to buy a point solution that they can't run because they can't hire people. And what makes it interesting too is like, you mentioned all the layoffs from these big tech companies. In the last 2 years with COVID and the great resignation in some ways, like that drove security salaries, which were already very high for the market compared to other IT fields, even higher. And so now we have people who are sitting at the very top of salary bands who either may have gotten laid off or are looking for their next jump, but that are not finding any room to go up. And so that makes it harder to find the next person who can come to your company who might help you with building out a program there. There is, some people think this is positive because it's like the stock market is too high on a bull run. They think it needs to be corrected and brought back down, but it doesn't mean it's easy, and it doesn't mean it's like there won't be bodies along the way from security programs. So I think people are going to have to rely on more managed services. And then I also think people for security teams, like try to be as abstract as possible from the technology itself. So like really double down on automation, really double down on platforms that can help you do actions without your direct point and click actions, like your SOAR vendors or any of your compliance automation vendors. And then offload the small stuff so that the few security resources you do have left can focus on the higher value stuff, like re-architecting your access roles in AWS, or helping you deploy a customer-facing service and what that looks like, and then bring in your managed service providers to do some of the heavy lifting on either side of that equation, either like customer-facing side or back-end side. So I think if people aren't focused on that, it's going to be really hard to get as much output and make as much progress on their programs.
Lots of great insight, guys. Thank you so much for answering to the context that you did. I think that's really going to be beneficial for folks on the line. Now, of course, I think a common trend with looking at next year is also taking a step back and reflecting on this past year. So I guess, what are some of your lessons learned with this past year? And Mike, I'll start with you.
I think the lessons learned from this year is that, like, honestly, there nothing is safe in terms of like what's on or off limits. I know we mentioned this already, but like the Russia-Ukraine conflict, that put things into a new perspective outside of just like the traditional threats and that we talk about on computers. And I think it's also introduced a lot of new areas of concern, especially as it relates to just basic infrastructure of how people work and live. And then not to mention any kind of forward-looking things that people want to do, perhaps in space. Like I think space security is going to be a very scary and real thing that people have to wrap their heads around, because that is geopolitical struggles. That is like whoever controls the skies can wield interesting levels of power on that. And so I think it's been a year of a kind of like surprise and enlightenment on that. I also think this year learned too, people are expecting a lot more acquisitions in terms of like really small companies. Like people are you can expect to get bought up a few times or acqui-hired if you have a decently good talent pool, or you have a decently good product offering. I think that'll be really interesting. And I think that'll continue on as we go, because going back to the managed services piece, like people have to find that talent somewhere, and best way to find the talent is to buy it in a lot of these cases. So I think we'll see that. And then, I also think, a lesson learned this year is like eventually, like if you get enough of like the heavyweights, like, the Microsofts and the Googles, like and the Apples, like you can really start to see some big pushes forward in terms of like making security better for everybody with like passwordless authentication and FIDO authentication alliances. And it's been interesting to see how they're trying to move like society forward on these aspects as well. So I think us as security practitioners and security companies, I think we'll all stand to benefit from all of these things as we go forward. So it's I'd say overall it's been a positive year on that front.
Awesome. And I couldn't agree more. The concept of space security still blows my mind when we can't even explore Antarctica. I'm really curious to see where that's going to lead us for sure. Jeremy, I'll pass it over to you. What are some of your lessons learned from this past year?
Yeah, I think, there's a couple key topics. I think the first one is the topic of risk management. And I think in security, it's kind of been this cliche concept of, we're in cybersecurity, we've got to say no to everything. And that's absolutely wrong, right? The business, whether we say no or not, is going to continue to evolve, continue to expand, continue to sell products, push new territories, push new limits. So I really think risk management is an interesting concept where while it's one of our primary jobs as security leaders, it's not necessarily about eliminating all the risk. It's really about understanding what is acceptable and then managing risk to that threshold, right? Because risk management is not about saying no. So, I think that's a big concept that out of 2022, we've seen that as organizations and development teams are pushing more and more product, right? Security is always kind of, I always look at it like the trend line, right? Security is always kind of fallen behind. And we need to kind of catch up to that, but we need to be flexible in kind of that risk management policy. The second thing also is, we've talked about a bunch of different concepts from vendor sprawl to getting more with less. So I won't hit that one, but the other one is business resiliency. So how do we prepare the business for that inevitable breach, right? So it's going to happen. The next Log4j, unfortunately, I'm the bearer of bad news, right? The next Log4j is going to happen. And the rhetorical question is, how prepared are you for that, right? Do you have visibility into your endpoints? Are you doing regularly and updated patching of your systems? Do you know who owns what asset? Do you know what's maybe been deprecated, right? And is that actually offline, or is that actually, in the right process and procedures to be deprecated? So, I mean, we can go on and on about this. This could be a whole nother conversation, but I think business resiliency, making sure that we're always staying up to date, we're educated in what's going on in the world, but also we're preparing our teams for that unexpected late night phone call, unfortunately, that we all hate and that we don't want, but it's part of our job, right? So how are we going to go forward with the plan and the procedures that we've tested, right? That we've gone and make sure we're testing and doing fire top and, or I should say fire drills and tabletop simulations. So business resiliency, risk management, I think is going to be more important than ever. It's definitely one of those things where, we saw it through Log4j where organizations weren't prepared. We saw with the geopolitical stuff, right? Kind of going back to the main themes of today's conversation where organizations weren't prepared. So I think, how do we get prepared, right? Where do we take the lessons learned of maybe we didn't do as great as an industry, and then prepare to get, just 2% better. And I think that's all it's going to take to be that much more sustainable as an industry and that much more secure as a company.
Again, Jeremy, thank you. And Mike, thank you for the great context, the conversation, just the breadth of everything that we've covered for predictions for next year, what we've learned. It's great conversation. So with our last few minutes, I'd like to emphasize everybody on the line, please go check out Return on Security, supported by Mike Privette. He has some great findings that are going to continue well into next year. Definitely go check it out. With that, thank you everybody for the time today, and we hope everybody has a great rest of their day. And again, thank you, Mike, for the time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Awesome. Have a good one, everybody.
Bye.